Hello everyone, today we talk about the Justinian era and more specifically of the peoples that began to pressure on the Byzantine frontiers after the end of the Gothic War, aside from, say, whichever other Mediterranean land was reconquered. As you know, there is a doubt whether southern Spain, for example, was reconquered before or afterwards this period. But in general, what had been the settlement of the Western reconquest by the armies of Justinian. And it's not the first time actually we address this topic, but it's just the immediate aftermath of the end of the war in Italy, basically. So we will not even arrive looking at the peninsula, for example, to the Longobard invasion that I actually made another video on specifically for Byzantine history series. So looking at, say, from the terrible, say, phraseology that has taken root on YouTube. Let's see this story from this guy's perspective, because, you know, against any of course, Clausewitzian law of reciprocity. But let's say at least when we look at things manualistically, we can also naturally give a different cut on the basis of what, you know, power we're focusing on. And then, of course, other groups sometimes we can't even properly track, right, in the way we would fully like, such as the Bulgars, the Slavs, the Huns. Then you have the Heruli, the Gepids, the Longobards, the Avars. It's really a huge mess, especially on the Danubian frontier, but also in Italy, that requires some minimal introduction. And also the Persian frontier that naturally was particularly important. And before starting with that, I will make a video specifically on the Gothic War, right? The Gothic Wars, altogether probably. But just for an introduction, then of course we'll get into, as we have already done for the Gothic sieges of Rome, for example. You find everything in either the Byzantine history or migration era or whatever playlist, like any major, let's say, theme subject, as you know, is being included in a playlist, right? And it's important to observe what, say, broader order the Byzantines had given to the Italian peninsula. And, say, civilly speaking, the administration post-Gothic War didn't actually change that much, right? Here we're still essentially, doesn't matter how much shattered by the war, a late antiquity society. The Byzantines, after all, have reconquered the entire peninsula. That is somehow quite complex within itself. There are substantial differences, but fundamentally the system was still, say, oriented at least, say, by policy to preserve what had been the latency system, the large estates. I made a video about Justinian's juridical production, and so we have observed there how the Pragmatica Sanctio was issued in Italy, even for the empire. I made different videos about the circulation of the Justinian Code for the history of law in Italy, and in this sort of, in fact, limbo between the Gothic War and the Longobards invasion, and after that, which is one of the most debated, or at least researched topics by the jurists, not only the historians of law, telling the truth. All right, but we understand, as it often happens historically, that of course there weren't, even after such a traumatic war that, as you know, was rendered worse by the plague that had began to strike, and that would engulf, basically, it's the pandemic that hit the whole Eurasia at some point. I will not digress specifically on this. This continuity is showed by the, for example, presence of a Praetorian prefect of Italy and a prefect and a vicary of Rome. The latter, as you know, would remain fundamentally within the empire, continuously until essentially the papacy and also the Franks would make it truly something on its own. But until the 12th century, the same popes played a bit like the Eastern card, depending on their interest, quite cleverly, by the way. Likely, even though we're not specifically informed about it, the vicary that had held the Italian diocese had been restored after the Byzantine victory. And the Italian territory, subject to a new Praetorian prefect, however, was remarkably reduced. Right, it limited itself to the Sole Peninsula. That means minus Sicily. That was instead held by a praetor dependent on the same Constantinople. Right, and I made a video both about Byzantine Italy, actually multiple ones, including in fact the one on Byzantine Sicily in particular, for the great strategic relevance, of course, that in the central Mediterranean the island really had, but say this had historically been so different land, right, from the mainland one. The same goes for Sardinia and Corsica, that passed under Africa, administratively speaking, and would remain historically a bit isolated, to say the least, from Constantinople, of course, as long as the Byzantines had a fleet and maintained their thalassocracy, especially before the Islamic invasions. There was a strong connection between these islands and Byzantine civilization as a whole. Right, I never made a video about medieval Sardinia, for example, but we'll have to get there at some point, because, as you know, this island maintained remarkably close administrative systems to what had been the Roman one historically, evolving still and developing sort of peculiar forms in medieval law, medieval institutions, but still, right, maintaining such peculiarity. But also because it had definitely distanced itself over the centuries from Constantinople, and even at this time, where in fact it would take quite essentially more than 1 century before the Byzantines would lose control of some parts of the Mediterranean. The contraction, especially after the Justinian plague of the, say, demographics and production, etc., did contribute to isolate these that were really the westernmost provinces, together with Spain and Africa, and that were in fact not, as we'll see now, considered excessively important compared to the others, right? Especially after the crisis, because actually the Justinian reconquest, and I made multiple videos, and this was, in my opinion, quite it made a lot of sense, right? There is also this anti-Frankish function that has been somehow overlooked, in my opinion, since being quite important since those times. Yet, even Italy, that of course contained Rome, and what does a Roman emperor do for a living? Well, he has to reconquer Rome. That's what Justinian does successfully, but that symbol alone was worth the reconquest. Not quite the lands necessarily themselves, and or at least the Byzantines were much more concerned about their Balkan, and especially Anatolian dimension, the Levant, still in their hands at this point, in spite of some problems, than Italy, right, or Spain, right? It was still, especially from a coastal point of view, a great relevance, but the interland especially was just culturally a very different thing in the first place. This would be worsened with, specifically for Italy, by the Longobards invasion, etc., but that's something, again, that we have already seen, we will not discuss today. So in many ways, in spite of the Byzantine victory over the Goths, that essentially disappeared as a free ethnic reality, the Byzantine imperial restoration was basically just apparent, or at least quite fragile, right? In reality, it brought, yes, to an end of the Italian political autonomy that, after all, as we've seen, historically had always maintained, right, from the emperors of Ravenna, even through Odoacer, Theodoric, etc. So this opens to a new phase in the history of the Italian peninsula. I made a video that is titled the Germanic Byzantine Destiny of Italy. All right, that sort of frames the question a bit by itself, also on the longer term in perspective. And the fact, yes, that this had been a land of conquest, so essentially and painfully for the Italian population, and this in fact was one of the main reasons why the Longobards succeeded big time later on, of the transfer of both the civilian and military government, together with the bureaucracy, by the way, with two elements, right, of Eastern origin, right? And of course there was, as always, a sort of cooptation and elite marriage and so on, but we must understand, and made that video about the Gothic sieges exactly about this, that in spite of the sort of pop cultural revival of the idea of Romanity, and the Byzantines were Romans, and whatever, as you know, I made hours-long videos just on this topic, because it's not that I disagree with it, but let's say the way we still use the term Byzantine is completely fine, as long as you understand what it's actually supposed to mean, which is not the easy sort of way that, again, they were just Romans, in a nominalistic sense, really just must attribute thinking that there is some intellectual substance to it, when they in fact don't even know properly Byzantine history themselves, and still the scholars in the field call themselves Byzantinists, and there is a reason that is a non-obvious one, which again I explained elsewhere. But again, the Byzantines now these Easterners, compared to the Italian peninsula, were not felt as truly as the same people anymore. These were foreign occupants, largely, right? Aside from the minority living in the still functional urban realities that, well, okay, the urban reality would continue to function across Italy pretty much at all time, differently from other areas of post-Roman Europe, but let's say that coastal, in part Greek-speaking, in fact, urban elite, right, was something very different from the overwhelming majority of the Latin Italic interland that truly is the one won over by the Longobards eventually. Right, and remember that this was the deal with Byzantine culture since the very beginning. This is exactly what the Greeks were doing in the classical age. They colonized the coasts. They didn't give a freaking damn about anything that existed outside of it, because outside of it, that was not Greek. That was not perfect. It was not in spite of Romanization, right? And that's why also we call Byzantine culture, with this sort of reinforcement of the Hellenic dimension of it. Whether they call themselves like that or not, which is in fact something which even offended them, because Greek meant pagan up to until the 15th century. Something was changing, at least in the wake of Western Renaissance, that was not triggered by the Byzantine scholars fleeing from the Turks, by the way. The difference with the rest of the world was total. Right, the idea of perfection, of perpetua sanctio, reinforced also by the Justinian regime, legally, ideologically, religiously, was, in this sense, sort of starting to alienate this ever more crystallized society from the outer side. And the outer side, in this context, could be very close, as a matter of fact. And in part, this was actually the peak of Byzantine civilization. I mean, if you read the Strategicon, you understand how much of that sort of Roman practicality and Hellenic intellectual brilliance this civilization really really had inherited, right? So, but that's why we call it Byzantine in many ways, because different cultures had contributed at different times in different ways to it, and it's important to draw this line. Let's say there is also another aspect of the Byzantine Italian government, that is, and I made a video about the militarization of the Ravenate and Roman militias. The fact that civil authority was gradually overshadowed by the military, right? This anticipated, since Justinian, a phenomenon that would have, after that, in fact, become characteristic of the Ravenate exarchate. And this in part because, of course, the Italian peninsula was to be turned by the Longobards into a huge frontier. So in many ways, actually, Byzantine Italy was very similar to the Longobard one by Constantinopolitan standards, as a matter of fact. Now, the military reorganization of Italy entailed the creation of, quite importantly, as was saying before, especially because of Frankish expansionism, as there had been raids, as you know, into Italy by the Franks and the Alemanni at the time of Narses, right? Of an Alpine frontier line with at least 4 border duchies. Just yesterday we were talking about the duchies of the Notizia Dignitatum, a bit before, of course, these times, but conceptually for the duchess, and also the influence that in this militarized region, that the titling would have osmotically passed even to other people, such as the Longobards, as Symmachoi / Federati of the Byzantines at this time, differently from the Franks, for example, that called their officials comites, counts. And of course, the Alps were the most obvious. Like if you take a satellite picture, you can't easily see, right? There is a massive and contained bulwark there that if you are defending Italy, of course, you have to take care of. There had already been, of course, important defense layers, systems since late antiquity, but also before in historical. At some point, we will talk more in depth about these sort of late antique and early medieval systems of defense, because their function is of course was the typical way, say, in depth in many ways, but we tend to forget that any frontier area had always been in depth, even in early imperial times, let's say. So we tend to be a bit Lutvakian over time, but it's interesting because these fortifications naturally go on, right? They keep working in Longobard times, when of course the Longobards had taken them over, against the Franks, and later on it's in turn, etc. Because there were all these various peoples across the Alps that had to be checked in some way. And naturally considered that that Italy had lost the upper hand on the territories across the Alps until Theodoric the Great, as you know. Ravenna controlled basically up to the Danube, right, and parts of Illyricum, from, in fact, west to east, right? We've seen it also for the Alemanni that were in part settled, in fact, under the Gothic rule in those lands that would made up part of Switzerland, exactly to defend the valleys as auxiliaries against the Franks. Here there were some problems, and essentially the Byzantines would call the Longobards to create a buffer state in the Po Valley that was sort of less Romanized, and so hoping to keep these people under control. Instead, the thing went out of hand, but hardly was something sudden or that was not planned together with the Romans. Also because we know that nothing in Constantinople was happening at the moment the Longobards entered Italy. It was no rush, no scramble, no armies moving, whatever. It was all likely planned, right? And speaking of Italy, differently from what had happened in Africa, a general command of the army was not, in fact, even instituted. In fact, the task kept being carried out by the same Narses that had remained there with extraordinary powers, for which he had been invested for the command during the Gothic War, even after protracting itself, even after the victory, the Byzantine victory, because of course there could be other raids, invasions, whatever. Hence, also the fairy tale actually that Narses would have invited the Longobards against the will of Justinian for jealousy, etc. The only true part of that, again, is what we were saying before. That likely, yes, there was an agreement that Narses handled, right? But given that the guy was given a state funeral in Constantinople, well, that's not what you do against a guy who has betrayed imperial authority and let, an invader taking over a country like the one of Rome. So this is just for saying how the Byzantines handled the Italian matter strategically. Now, this completed in many ways the Western reconquest. Again, aside from Spain, before or after, this is not even too important. Just Baetica, the most Romanized parts of coastal Spain remain in Byzantine hands. The hinterland was Visigothic. In Africa, as you know, just like in Italy with the Goths, right, the Vandals were in part left as frontier garrisons, albeit there was a Byzantine administration there. But the big chunk, right, of the reconquest had always been Italy, and it had cost a lot, as you know, if anything, because of command problems, jealousies, what had happened between Belisarius and Justinian, the fact that armies made thrice back and forth across the peninsula, destroying great swaths of it in the process, because otherwise everything would have been smoother, and who knows in terms of the resources that the Byzantines could have used even to defend Italy later on. But it wasn't like that. So everything actually was going fine after all. I mean, yes, there had been these problems, but hey, the Western Mediterranean, the still beating heart of late antique culture in the area, was again back under the control of Constantinople, and this time not like a Western half autonomous from the Eastern one. Now it was basically, yes, it was considered like still Western part, but under the command, right, of the Constantinopolitans, if we can say. So when things started going wrong is on the Eastern Front, right? The other big problem of the empire had always been Persia, right? The West had not been so threatening or too threatening, right? Persia was a much more compact threat to the same Constantinople, and it had to be addressed on a regular basis with enormous expenses and with great strategic difficulties, because you can't wrestle essentially from the Persians the control of the Levant of Mesopotamia, but you can't quite just engulf yourself into an invasion of the Iranian plateau. That's a major strategic fit. You can crush the Persian Empire in battle, as the Romans had done and would keep doing historically, so that it would fragment itself. But from the Persian plateau, a new dynasty would reemerge at some point, and it was not really feasible to simply occupy, especially with the demographic and agricultural resources of the 6th century. Right? Already, again, the Western reconquest had been very costly to some extent. So the Byzantines had established historically a quite layered frontier that we in part saw even yesterday with the duchies of Armenian Mesopotamia. And in this case, even with Thebite, because as you know, the Sasanians at the peak of their power even conquered, subjected at least Arabia. They even had an influence in Ethiopia. So that's something that would threaten the same Egypt, and at some point they actually took it over right? In the last wars against the empire, we still have to make a bit about that. And I skip all the considerations, of course, on the the Levantine subjects' allegiance, right, to the empire, right, compared to the Persians, all the religious disputes, and so on. We're all aware of that, right? The other sector that was quite a pain in the behind, because it was relatively less relevant, but still some very close to Constantinople, was that is located in there is the Balkans, right? That would see, in fact, on both fronts, the general negative outcome for the empire. The peace with the Persians, concluded by Anastasius I, was maintained until the end of Justin I's reign, when in the Caucasian region of Lazica, on the Black Sea, and in Mesopotamia, the hostilities between the Persians and the Romans broke out once again, and they had, been dragging on with alternate fortune until exhaustion, practically, in 532, with the so-called perpetual peace that had allowed eventually the Justinian reconquest, if you look at the years, and with which, on the Persian frontier specifically, the status quo ante the war had been reestablished. So this was basically a draw in terms of territorial acquisitions, at least, and yet had obliged the Byzantine Empire to pay a heavy tribute to Persia anyway. And this was how, many ways, politics still works today. Internationally, still all pay tributes to one another for different reasons, to keep balance, right? But also because it's really not convenient to make a war most of the cases. Now, Justinian accepted to pay for this tribute exactly to have free hand in the West. He didn't have, in fact, conquest ambitions in that sector. And again, it's, by some it's criticized. People say, well, but the problem always came from the East, right? If the Byzantines had concentrated with that. But the actual point is that either, like in this case, what could be reconquered in the West was much more fruitful, objectively, and in fact would help the empire, in spite of the fact that we have to use this narrative. Oh yes, but after it was the plague and this avalanche of people. Yeah, okay, but the fact that they had conquered all this stuff, and part of which was also maintained over time, was an advantage. Right then, again, attacking Persia, the Middle East, the Mashrek, into mountainous areas. Yes, there are cities here and there, but the question is, concretely, how can you expect to hold that on a longer term? Because at the end of the day, again, it's always the same problem. You can even win, as the Byzantines would do at Nisibis in the 7th century, destroying the Sasanian Empire, fine, but what happened again is you destroy Mesopotamia. And then what happened in the Iranian plateau? Now, in that scenario, of course, they exhausted each other. The Arabs came around and they sort of managed to score the big hit on the empire, but they also got absorbed. I mean, the same caliphate got, the Arab caliphate got Persified in the Middle East, etc. So it's always the same issue in so many ways. It's a feudal, fragmented plateau of enormous extension. It's incredibly difficult. Nobody really ever occupied it, if not like migrating peoples like the ones from Central Asia that settled there and basically kept running a Persian state, right? And Persified and sort of cut connections also with the ancestral lands in the steppes. So the Byzantines were making the right thing here. I'm deeply convinced of that. So the Persians were, by the way, a considerable power against which you had to measure yourself on a plane of parity at that point, especially since, in fact, just the eastern half of the Roman Empire had remained. At that point, again, the Persians this is the only moment in which they arrived later on, especially to even gaining the upper hand on this balance for a while. Then still the Romans had the capacity of striking back and destroying them, so that really means a lot, because again, civilization is not a matter of personal opinion. And yes, the Byzantines were more of a civilization than the Persian one, and the fact that the Persians were older doesn't mean much in that regard, and they had their own share of problems, falls, collapses at the hands of the very Romans historically. But they were dangerous, and they had a hell of a military, right? And so if you were to really harass the Byzantines, reactivating the war on the Eastern Front by, say, depleting and trying to deplete them of men and resources was something, again, risky for the same actors, but still something that would be serious enough for Constantinople to get involved in. The substantial equivalence of the forces prevented, at that point, also a de facto resolution to the conflict. Again, already at the time of Anastasius I, the same operations had ended up for fragmenting themselves in this very tiring, inconclusive actions that were just depleting the empire further for no concrete gain. The perpetual peace was, however, short-lived. Right, it began in 540. Right, just 8 years. It's not bad for a perpetual, right, perennial truce. And profiting, in fact, of the Byzantine commitment in Italy, and considered this also what Persian intelligence could be in terms of, actually, how long will the Byzantines take to reconquer the West, right? Italy got turned into a mess eventually, so the Persians knew this, and surely they had calculated things along this pattern. King Khosrow I, we will talk more about the Sasanian history, the Sasanian military, attacked, by the way, suddenly, right, the eastern frontier of Constantinople, opening thus a new phase of the war that would have dragged on for other 20 years, right? The Persians succeeded in penetrating the Byzantine province and meeting actually scarce resistance, sacking numerous cities, pushing up to Antioch of Syria that fell, right, in the same year, by the way, after a very short siege. At that point, Khosrow had scored a major hit, right, was satisfied enough to withdraw in his own territories. However, in the 4 ensuing years, he kept attacking the empire, still scarcely countered by the Byzantine generals, as the major forces were invested elsewhere. Consider the difficulties that the same Persians had in still attacking what was still a defended Byzantine frontier, right? So this was a major debacle for Constantinople regionally, but it's still like the Persians couldn't make miracles just per se, and even though they kept harassing the Byzantines, still there was a limit to their own strategic capacities and an advantage in this context. So in 545 there was a quinquennial truce that, however, did not count for the Lazica region, again in the Caucasus, where operations dragged on until 557, when there was a renewal of the truce that interested also that region. which was particularly important because it allowed, essentially controlled it allowed the Persians to have an important control of on parts of the Black Sea, right? Getting the upper hand from that side of the watershed and controlling some, consequently also some areas of the hinterland behind it, and together with some trade routes and an interesting involvement also north of the Caucasus, etc. The tiredness of the contendants, however, brought to an end. Like it's like today, you can even launch in full-scale invasion, but you can't quite protract that for too long, right? Eventually, both systems are exhausted, or at least they can't drag on with significant victories like before, because simply resources run out, right? And they were particularly limited in these times. In 561, there was a peace that would finally last half a century, which speaks of this sort of exhaustion. If you study the military history of Europe, the Mediterranean, you realize that in the second half of the 6th century, there's a major, again, contraction, even properly military expeditions. There are less resources, there are less people due to the plague, etc. And so, I don't know, look at the Merovingian armies of the time of Clovis that are still, 30,000 men still with Roman units, artillery, strong supply lines, etc. You look at Merovingian armies at the end of the 6th century, they're just hunting parties, right? Just like they went hunting, they went killing their own brothers, basically. So, and on a much shorter range, strategically, too. So the substance of the 50 years truce of 561 repropose yet again this now centuries-old status quo, next to minor clauses that essentially were just contingent for the local needs of the parts in conflict. The frontiers of Armenia and Mesopotamia were confirmed, and the Persians renounced to their demands on Lazica, abandoning the last positions that they held there, and in exchange for that, Justinian agreed to pay a strong yearly tribute, right? So again, basically nothing changes more than much. At least some borders are redrawn or confirmed on the previous basis. You have the Persians asking too much in terms of that Black Sea region. Constantinople keeps paying a tribute to the Persians. In this regard, you see how still the Persians were sort of the weaker side, in spite of all. The Balkan Peninsula. In all this, this frontier, as vast as it was sacked repeatedly by, not a major power, but still altogether an imposing force of bands of more or less consistent, in fact, invading armies that came from the regions north of the Danube. And it's difficult for us to even understand exactly who's who, right? Because also Byzantine literature is not that sort of critical, precise, or abundant at this point. We know barely what was happening at the court or in international policy, government, etc. So you can imagine about this conjury of population that had sort of blended, sedimented, alternated in these attacks and settlements at some point. The Byzantines didn't have their finest forces in the Balkans because there wasn't too much to lose. Yes, the hinterland was pretty vast, but it was also primitive. It had declined historically from quite a while. There were resources that could be of course, damaged. Even if it had been for a single season, it would have created problems in the entire system. But after all, it was unrealistic for any of the powers present there at the time to just push for Constantinople or even major cities on the Aegean. So after all, even the settlement of the Slavs, for example, was something that, as you know, tended to actually increase the local labor force, because these people were to settle down, and at the end of the day, Byzantine deterrence and power was still enough to eventually control them. Consider that in Europe overall, the empire was still considered as such, but it was not just a corner of the continent. Everyone, even in Scandinavia or in the British Isles, recognized that Constantinople was the Roman Empire and that it was always the one it had been, in spite of crisis, contraction, and the entire universal Catholic delegation of power stemmed from there, by the way. Just the Persians that had been quite influenced by the Romans themselves were proposing a sort of different routes on an ethnic basis regarding their own universal empire, etc. But at the end of the day, it was all about the same meaning. There weren't great generals on the Balkan frontier, at least rarely they sort of distinguished themselves. But the problem was more consistently the scarcity of troops available, because, as we've seen, the West and the East had essentially been the destinations for most of the Byzantine army, right, as they were of preeminent interest. The defense of the Balkan frontier was thus intentionally overlooked, right? Justinian limited himself to use diplomacy, buying peace with the enemies, and starting a systematic program of fortifications with the purpose especially safeguard the civilian populations from the damages of the invasions that were mostly raids, right? In part, of course, there were some areas were occupied, certain communities destroyed, etc., but more than else, right, the Balkan Peninsula has also orographically that sense, right? There is a northern part and with strategic centers that the Byzantines still held at this point, by the way, to an important degree. In fact, north of the Balkan Mountains on the Danube, right? And then you have this sort of permeable, in fact, frontier all across that can be pierced without too much even damage structurally to the same, but obviously with important damage to the people that lead beyond that, right? The way that the Byzantines had dealt with was, of course, with the accepting the gradual depopulation of the areas closer to the Danube that had become, in fact, a fortified, militarized frontier, with a difficulty, of course, in controlling it, and a sort of not really a no man's land, also because it was imperial territory strictly, but still importantly the populated area that would have sort of acted as a buffer state to discourage, of course, raids that were more short range normally, and or at least for the more important strategically operations. It would have also deprived of important resources the advancing armies. So again, in the absence of major regional power before the settlement of the Avars, this system could be neglected in the way that we have seen, right? And this is, in fact, the constant characteristic of such people's movements, the transient nature of the same. After having sacked the imperial territory, the invaders retreated in their own lands. There were different types. Of course, there were the more sedentary ones that, as we've seen, tended even to gravitate around the empire in the first place and even settling within it. Territory. And the nomads that were traditionally more, in fact, itinerant and yes, raided, were a pain behind, etc., but in a sense were also less relevant as long as we're scattered a bit as all these other tribes, right? We're essentially war bands, more or less. Of course, these different peoples cooperated with one another. This will be very evident, especially when, in fact, the Avars established their khaganate in the Pannonian Basin, and as they could mobilize the various Slavs that they would in part also coerce in their expeditions against Constantinople, as they needed also, troops, infantry for sieges, etc. The Avars were mostly nomadic, but they had also a hell of polyurcetic. So the rhythm and the violence of aggression varied over time. Towards the mid-6th century, it had been increasing until the disastrous incursion suffered by the empire from the Bulgars that added to this most worrying outcome, that is, for the first time, the capture of Byzantine cities proper. Right, I will make more videos about the Bulgars, but as you know, these were essentially Turkic, Indo-European mixed populations that had managed unitly here to concentrate enough power to storm significant strongholds, occupying them, and using them for further incursions down south, highlighting the erosion of Byzantine territorial control over these areas. Of the mosaic of peoples that gravitated around the Danubian frontier after the disgregation of the Hunnic Empire in the mid-5th century, a very important role had been played by the aforementioned Bulgars, by the Germanic Heruli, Gepids, and Longobards, but also by the Slavs and by the same relics of the Hunnic people. We're talking about an important set of groups, right? Bulgars tended to have a confederal profile, the word nomadic. The Germanic groups were also, depending on the size, right, more or less, essentially a confederacy. And or at least they had been born as such. For example, some of these peoples had been able to eliminate some internal ethnic differences to some degree, so that, say, more or less all the Gepids were Gepids, the Longobards were Longobards. The Heruli had eventually been crushed by the Longobards and obliged to come back to northern Europe, at least the remains of them. The Gepids had settled in the Carpathian Basin, the Longobards in the Pannonian one, and especially the latter two had began to war against each other, which a quite different alternation consistently in Byzantine support towards one and the other, and the Longobards ended up eventually with the appearance of the Avars to crush the Gepids. Right, they attacked them together. There were multiple battles, of which we also know relatively few. Right, for the Longobards, we have Paul the Deacon writing in the 8th century. We have some Byzantine sources about that, and yes, something more overall. But we realized that more things were going on than we think. The Gepids were basically absorbed in the region. Eventually, in part they were deported by the Longobards, in part they were subjugated by the Avars. And I made multiple videos about the Longobards, especially just because they lived on to have a much greater future. The Gepids instead sort of disappeared from history. I made a video on them, but we'll come back hopefully on them, because that's quite an interesting people as well. And these two were fighting essentially for the control of Sirmium, right, of Sinjidun, of those areas that basically the Byzantines had ended up subcontracting The Gepid rule was, actually concentrated there rather than the Carpathian Basin, but that was also rich in mines, so they tended to make this sort of very oligarchic mechanism that also probably depleted the resources of the Gepid freemen so much that we see that also from archaeology, right? The Gepid elites were very, very rich. In fact, we have also lots of jewelry and stuff like that. But the freemen's graves were poor in weaponry. The Longobards instead were much more compact in that sense. They had a much bulkier freeman class that had its own share of equipment in a more uniform way, and so this likely contributed to the Longobard victory that was a close one as well. Plus, we have the Slavs that, as you know, I made lots of videos about them, their migration in the Balkans and more. They had been pouring very gradually, right, in much smaller groups, very often following these other ones from some areas of the Pripyat forests. There are actual forests, not marshes, as it's normally said. There's a bit of both, but mostly forests. And that had sort of sprung out when other peoples had abandoned the surrounding areas, and so basically overwhelming, even in with substantial numbers, at least as a culture, right? Because obviously they came to rule in territories that were populated by, that had gone depopulated, let's be honest, in an important part, of course, but that's the old thing, right? When we say the Slavs, it's linguistic sort of thing that it's like, I don't know, in the times of the Indo-European invasions, the Indo-Europeans were less, but they managed to linguistically take over. And this is well documented. The Slavs were a blend today, of course, of like any other people of the branch with the previous populations. The Huns too had remained around in different ways. In the Justinian armies, you could see all these peoples that we listed. They all had a role. As you know, the Longobards fought for Belisarius in Italy even before migrating, or exactly also, in fact, because they had served him, migrating in the peninsula later on. And different, the Huns, right? Hunnic cavalry was present all over. These forces were employed all over the Byzantine frontiers, really, which really must make way more videos on the topic. And they had different characteristics. The Huns had remained fundamentally nomadic. The Slavs were sedentary instead. At least they were on the move. But just like the Germans were a sedentary population and were there also to stay. Without mentioning that, of course, when you stretch eastwards across the steppes, you find different groups, different, let's say, conglomerations. I made a series last spring about Eurasian steppes warfare, in which we see all these various forces also in their individual military, cultural outlook, right? And all together, for different reasons, these peoples attacked the Byzantine territory, sometimes at the same time, and exactly exploiting this local superiority when joining forces. And at other times, or at the same time, even sort of signing treaty of alliance with the same Justinian that was recognized as the most powerful, of course, medium of God on earth, as the true ruler of the great Constantinople and Rome. Now, so the relations here between imperial authority and these populations individually are inexplicable in such a short time. In any case, as we know, Bulgars, Longobards, and Slavs would have had a remarkable role in the later Byzantine history. The Bulgars, or Proto-Bulgars, were a population composed of these Turkic elements plus some Indo-European ones. Interestingly enough, we see them from Bulgar epigraphies, that some were written Indo-European as well. There were groups of Huns within them. And in a sense, they represented on the Balkan front the most difficult threat to cope with, militarily speaking. In the second half of the 7th century, they would end up to settle for good, as you know, within the Byzantine frontiers, at the point that they really represented this sort of counter empire within this regional context, very close to Constantinople, and at some point, of course, absorbing a lot of Byzantine culture themselves, converting to Christianity again. If you search in my Byzantine history, but also the early medieval playlist, you'll find plenty of stuff I made already on these various dynamics that are notorious, but I just say it because, of course, people don't know often that how much stuff is out there. I see it from the stats. Well, the Longobards, too, we discussed really extensively. We will always keep doing so because they are some of the most underrated Germanic peoples, right? People get interested in them either to say, they were the top of garbage that, came over the empire after all what have happened, but and they stop studying their history, right? Somebody remembers them because at some point Charlemagne defeated them, but nobody tells you the story that they became the single most civilly advanced Latin Germanic kingdom, the only functional elective monarchy that I can think of, with a literate urban elite and having a massive legacy in European juridical tradition, and becoming ward of the same Franks, given that Charlemagne acquired their crown differently from any other people in that regard, and that were even actually the strongest power in Western Europe in the second half of the 7th century, when the Merovingians were basically fragmented into 4 chunks. And yes, they before the Carolingian conquest, they were actually to conquer the entirety of the Italian peninsula from the Byzantines, right? At this time, they were just one of the roughest Germanic peoples that had come just straight from a series this summer that I will continue at some point about Longobard origins, right? And they rose up the Elbe River essentially from the Baltic. And they arrived in Moravia and then in Pannonian Basin, from there just in Italy. But before that, even though they had already had this important relation with the empire, they were quite distant from that. In 539, they signed an alliance with the empire, but they still sacked, its territory, and that's how always it worked, just like the Bulgars, right? They served, as we are recalling, in the armies of Justinian before the Great Migration that would lead them to Italy. When you read the pseudo Maurice's Strategicon, and I made a video about the so-called blonde-haired people, as they were called by the Byzantines. That is actually a synecdoche for, let's say, speaking of the Germans broadly meant. But they actually mean the Longobards, right? People say it's actually the Franks because the Franks are sort of considered, of course, more powerful in general, but we tend to forget that the Longobards were not just bordering and actually invading the Byzantine territories, but that kind of half of the people was actually in service of the Byzantines, and that they represented the largest Germanic component of the Byzantine army. They were deployed everywhere in the Balkans from Italy, right? Not from when they were on the Danube before. In Armenia, in many places, they also reached some very important positions in the Byzantine army hierarchy. We will hopefully see all this in detail at some point, but just for saying how relevant this population really was. And again, there is a beautiful Longobard history playlist there. You can see any aspect, right, from the most civil to the most warrioristic, we can say. Now, the Slavs that in the second half of the 6th century would have settled in the Balkans instead came from, as we've seen, essentially the eastern, from Eastern Europe, largely part Central Europe, and in part towards the end of the 5th century, they occupied the northern bank of the Danube, and from Belgrade to the estuary, right in between, basically first the Avars, then later the Magyars would have separated the Slavs, like the Western Slavs from the Southern Slavs. And there would be a lot to say about the connection between the Slavs and other peoples. Right, we know that, for example, in Moravia, the Longobard-dominated Moravia, before the Longobards moved to Italy, there were already Slavs settled. And in fact, there is some interesting connection genetically between some finds in Longobard graves from the 6th century in Italy and modern Polish population. This thing, of course, is ever more complex, to some degree even less documentable with clarity in Central, say, in Europe, Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans, because it's not much the genetic evidence that helps us in tracing what happened, because quantitatively speaking, we lack substantial evidence. It's history that helps, also because we know that the situation was much more politically fragmented, and so in these areas, and so aside from the fact that we must know exactly who moved where when, and we're often not lucky for the eastern half of Europe to know how it happened. Without documentary historiographical confirmation, you can't really resolve things, even archaeologically, not just genetically, of course. So it's not clear entirely either how compact the Slavs were. I mean, we understand that we're naturally we're looser compared to these other populations that had also been mostly subjected to these same. The reason is that they had sprung out of some of the most depressed parts of Europe. They had done so again just when the stronger groups had moved. Great part of these lands had been depopulated, were also colder and just less populated historically, with poor communications, and there was essentially no urban culture. And this brought to even a greater desperation in a way, so that the need to move, even just in small groups, just to save their skins to some degree. And this brought them, however, still to create some greater polities and to exercise a growing pressure on the Byzantine frontier since their first appearance, right? Even if the first incursions witnessed date to the time of Justin I, so not quite later time, they increase, right? They say the Slavs with which specifically Constantinople came to contact in the 6th century belonged to two main groups, which are somehow contested to some degree, but I made a video explaining this differences. There is a Slavic history playlist if you're interested in this. The Sclavini that were settled along the lower Danube, that reached from there, in fact, up to the Dniester River. Quite a position, because that was, by the way, the corridor from which usually steppe peoples would have increasingly come to pour in the Danubian Valley. The Antes that occupied a vast area of the steppes of today's Ukraine, essentially, from Bessarabia to the Donetsk. And both the Sclavini and the Antes served occasionally as mercenaries in the Byzantine armies, pretty much obvious, and at the same time they aggressed in tribal groups the empire, causing remarkable damage and devastation. The Slavs tended to have this more demographic settlement, because there were many, but as we've seen, split in different brooklets. Some reached the Peloponnesian hinterland, some took boats and reached North Africa even, so they were quite pervasive. And many of them simply became Byzantine subjects as a consequence. It's normal for them to, at some point, even leaving within the Byzantine frontiers, participating to raids against the empire when other invaders came along, while, say, simultaneously serving as mercenaries in the same Byzantine army, depending on depending on the situation, right? The situation, however, on the Balkan frontier had, however, remained fairly stable until the Avars came around, right? The Longobards and the Gepids had been essentially crashing against one another. Yes, they tried to harass the Byzantine frontier, but again, it was a militarized, distant one. They went different ways. The Slavs created these problems, but they were also not really a single polity creating a regional threat that could overrun the empire. The Avars, instead, were something different, or at least were to become. After a couple of generations, they had settled in the Carpathian Basin. This was a nomadic people of Turko-Mongolian stock, right? There were surely other groups within them, the Avars. These other nomadic populations were called shepherds of peoples, right? The same Slavs that we describe now sometimes migrated following the trail, these guys under them. And this was normal, really. It's an aggregative dynamic that you find even with the Longobards, with other populations that the more numerous they were, and the more easily, in a sense, they could overrun a territory, especially as we've seen in places like Italy or the Balkans that were not properly defended by the Byzantine armies. The Avars had an interesting ethnogenesis, as we've said here. Some elements came in from East Asia. This had been the case also for the Huns. There surely were present some groups among them. In any case, they brought together with them a sort of important military system. As we said before, they had a hell of a polysthetics, especially mutated from China, or Chinese models anyway, and they would be described in the Strategicon as essentially the most military competent of all the barbarians described, accounted in their entirety from the Byzantine perspective, let's say. In 557, the Avars essentially showed up in the north of Caucasus, pushed in turn by the Turks of Central Asia that would have kept pouring in different waves. 4 years later, the Avars had reached the Danube, subjugating in part, as we've seen, those Slavs that inhabited there and other peoples that had settled as well. And they asked the Byzantines to settle in the Bruja, on the mouth of the Danube, which was an important compromise because they would actually push further, as we will see better in another video. Justinian refused, but he was equally obliged to pay a tribute to establish a sort of precarious alliance relation with them. They would have gone on actually to occupy again the Carpathian Basin and to establish there. After a while, though, this most powerful Khaganate, right? Many, as I was saying before, also for the destruction of the Gepids at the hands of the Longobards and these Avar help. At that time, the Avars were fragmented politically. They had not founded that sort of monarchy that would have eventually threatened the same Constantinople later on. And summoning all these Slavic subjects from the outskirts of, at that point, a territorially established polity, the Avars launched raids into Merovingian Germany. They harassed northeastern Italy in Longobard times, and more, really. But that's later, right? Don't confuse people's strength with the kind of equipment they had. Yes, the Avars had quite advanced arms and armor, but that's because they had an important elite that could afford that on a substantial basis, right? What made their power was their political compactness. That was achieved, however, a bit later after their arrival and settlement. That's the reason why here in the Bruges they hesitated even to push further in, because they weren't what they would have become later in terms of power. So this picture is, as you understand, messed up enough because the Avars would become quite a threat later on for the Byzantines, also in quite unpleasant times for things going on, especially against the Persians and other threats. But it's important to stress how these peoples were, if not necessarily coordinated all the time, but definitely, very aware of each other's strengths and weaknesses, and so, say, attacking the empire in this case in ways that would, of course, exploit its weakness during another attack. We've seen it with Khusrau I during the Italian campaign, right? They knew what was going on all the time, right? The fact that we don't, because they were practically literate, and they, talking about the last ones we described in the video, they, of course, they didn't live as much from their perspective, in fact, but these peoples knew much more about the Byzantine Empire in proportion to what the empire knew about them historically, right? In Constantinople, there was a much sort of more concrete interest in the immediacy of the territorial realities, and of course you couldn't quite even easily, let's say, predict when these peoples would show up or not. But of course these peoples that were more desperate compared to the empire, this is the thing we have to fix clearly, were much more interested in it and would seek information much more on it than the empire would do with them. And the Byzantines did a lot of ethnography, as you know, and sort of properly historical military inquiry on these peoples. That is a pleasure to read in the Strategicon, etc. But these peoples knew of Constantinople sometimes even before Constantinople knew of them, or at least would become a special threat. Because even though we have, especially like in a Western sense, sort of from an important time in our culture, thought of the barbarians as sort of the cataclysm that arrives and destroys everything and whatever, which technically never happened in Europe, right? Everything was like the invaders were always somehow absorbed, and it's still the local system that prevailed as a whole, even with those important cultural contribution. The situation of these peoples was incredibly dangerous, delicate, and precarious, much more than this major political and territorial masses like the Byzantine one really were. Right? That's why before I was also pointing out that the Sasanians had still a weaker grasp, because they didn't have like the same level of centralization the Byzantines had. Right, if not in Mesopotamia, but as an acquisition of a foreign land, whereas their historical center was the Iranian plateau. It was feudal. It was large enough also to be quite shaded in terms of actual control from the top, because some areas were basically settled in the same way by these occupants, and sometimes they were needed even as fuel for all these raids against the empire. It's something you see even in later times, in the times the Middle East is overrun by the Turks. It's pretty much the same thing. If you have that sort of contingent need of troops from the external to make the bulk of your military machine work, I mean, the Sasanians had a very advanced military, but say it means that you still have sort of less political and strategical options. You are much less stable on a territorial basis. The Byzantines, on the other hand, that had this aforementioned advantage of having inherited a great deal of that Hellenic urban coastal centralized let's say dimension, which had anchored like properly the basis of the empire to that very specific dimension, not merely as it had happened with the West with a colonization that surely molded the in fact even the ethnic face of the West culturally, but that had been about the hinterland in that regard. Right, that's why East and West differ so much already in Roman times, because they were a completely different formula to so much degree. Right? I mean, the Romans didn't colonize and culturally influence the East as much as the West, right? But to a massive degree. So the West had been dissolved, but the Byzantines themselves now were to cope with the realization that they had very strong bases, but they also entailed a mild control on the hinterland, especially in certain areas. And so, as we've seen on the Balkan and the Anatolian front, there were continuous problems with major cities, even like Antioch, falling at some point. The problem of the other guys is that they couldn't quite do much about it in the first place themselves. I mean, once they could score that result, but what about holding that center? Right. It wasn't so obvious, especially at this point, considering that, in spite of the crisis, late antiquity, especially in the Byzantine world, had evidently not died yet, that there was enough force to support the empire, in fact, against its enemies for the locals' benefits. When this comes less, as it had happened in the West, at least compared to this Byzantine model, it had become more of a foreign one rather than a Roman one. And in the East, with religious struggle, taxation, with the Levant giving way to the Arabs, well, and the thing is always complex, right? Because it's never like a fully consensual thing. It's complex, right? It has to do about the size of moral majority of the population, which can mean a lot of things, because of course a peasant doesn't have a moral capacity equivalent to the one of an elite individual. So, and that's what makes things change, because the first are weak, the latter are strong in qualitative terms. So everything can happen, everything can go wrong. As we've seen, the same Gothic war had its share of problems, despite the initial victory, practically, of the Byzantines in just one campaign. And so internal problems are also something that plagued the Justinian Empire. But that's also a bit the charm of it, this sort of strange double press by Procopius that first... So we do not know exactly how these works were written, that's the point. First praises Justinian and then says he was a monster, basically. With a hidden work, of course, because it would have been illegal to do so, but just for saying how few we know, because this world was being ruled by the Byzantines. Right, fortunately, the Romano-Germanic one would go on with a much more critical insight into... It's paradoxical that eventually the sort of critical thinking from the Hellenic world would have successfully been adapted to the Latin Germanic West, while the Byzantines would have sort of instead maintained on the longer run that sense of categoristic traditionalism rather than a leaving, right, one attribute to individuals. It was just that society was changing, right? It was becoming ever less capable of change. It was contracting. This was actually, again, a very florid time, telling the truth, for considering how other peoples were faring in comparison. Again, this is Justinian period is a bit the acme, in fact, of Byzantine civilization, and so we haven't made so many videos about the late 6th and the early 7th century. We must do that. We surely, like by exclusion, pop up, go on, and those do explain like the entire. We never talk Heraclius, just making an example. So we have to be particularly. That's a very important knot in Byzantine history, and we'll have to cover it. But I'm glad we made so much on the Justinian era, because that's also a very important milestone, like a cornerstone as well, for the interpretation of Byzantine history. It can't quite be denied, can't quite be overlooked, right? Very well, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.